Bethany dwi. Rwy'n wedi bod yn aelod o Capel-Galedu ers 6-7 mis nawr. Doctor dwi'n gweithio yn Ysbyty Gwynedd yn Bangor. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Bethany, and I've been part of the church for a few months now. And I'm a doctor. I'm working in Ysbyty Gwynedd. So it's been a few years since I last spoke at the front of church, so you'll have to bear with me, but I'm really hoping we can learn something together this morning. So, da ni darllen Ioan eto bore yma, Ioan pennod 9. So we're reading John 9 this morning, which I have titled Asking the Right Question, Gofyn y Cwestiwn Cywir. Dwi'n mynd darllen yn Saesneg and Gymraeg, so I'm going to read in English and Welsh. If you've got Bibles with you, I'd really encourage you to open them up as I'll keep referring back to the passage as we're going along. But if not, the words will be on the screen hefyd. So, yn Gymraeg, Ioan, pennod 9, vers 1. Un dirnod roedd, Iesu'n pasio hebio, a gwelodd ddyn oedd wedi bod yn ddall ers iddo gael enni. Gofynodd y disciples iddo, Rabbi, pwy wneith bechu achos i'r dyn yma gael yn dall? Fo eich hun neu rieni? Dim y bechod o, na fechod y rieni sy'n gyfrifol, meddai Iesu. Digwyddodd y mwyn ei allu Deo gael y ddangos yn y fywyd. Tra mae hi'n dal yn olau dydd, siarad i ni wneud gwaith yr yn sydd wedi fi anfon ni. Mae'r nos yn dod pan ffydd neb yn gallu gweithio. Tra dwi'n y byd, fi ydi gola'r byd. Ar ôl dweud llun, poerodd y lawr gwneud mwr allan o poerin, ac wedyn ei rwbio y lygad ydyn dall. Yn y meddai wrtho, dosi ymolchi y bwll Siloam, enw sy'n golygu anfonwyd. Felly, aeth y dyn i ymolchi, a phan ddaeth yn ôl, roedd yn gallu gweld. Dyma gymdogion a phawb oedd wedi weld o'r blaen yn cardota yn gofyn, onid hwn ydy'r dyn oedd yn arfer cardota? Roedd rhai yn dweud ia, ac eraill yn dweud nace. Mae'n debyg iawn iddo. Ond, dyma'r dyn ei hun yn dweud, ia, fi ydi o. Ond, sut wyt ti'n gallu gweld, medden nhw? Ydyn mae'n hwnna elyn Iesu wneud fod ei rwbio fi slygaid meddai. Yn y dweud wrtho i am fynd i Siloam i ymolchi, a dyna nes i. Ar ôl i mi ymolchi, roedd yn gallu gweld. Lle mae o, medden nhw? O'n i dim, meddai. And I'll read again, starting at verse 1 in English. So, as he went along, this is Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who has sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. As long as it is day, we must do the works of him who sent me. Night is coming when no one can work. While I am in the world, I am the light of the world. After saying this, he spit on the ground, made some mud with the saliva, and put it on the man's eyes. Go, he told him, wash in the pool of Siloam. This word means sent. So the man went and washed and came home seeing. His neighbours and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, Isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was, and others said, No, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes opened, they asked. He replied, The man they called Jesus made some mud and put it on my eyes. He told me to go to Siloam and wash, so I went and washed, and then I could see. Where is this man, they asked. I don't know, he said. I don't know if any of you here have ever been in a situation similar to this one. Perhaps something has gone wrong in your life. Perhaps something big. Maybe you've lost a job. Maybe you've become unwell. Or maybe a family member has even died. Or perhaps you have a dream for your life that you've been waiting for a really long time, and it just hasn't seemed to come to anything. And we share these things with each other, don't we? And sometimes in a failure to know what to do or say or how to make sense of the things in our life that aren't going well, we can end up picking apart our lives, trying to find an explanation or a reason why something has happened. In an attempt to make sense of suffering, we so often seek to place the blame somewhere. It's such a human response. I have done it myself many times, and it happens all the time at work. when a mistake happens, people are so quick to point the finger and say, it's your fault, that it's that person that's done something wrong, when actually, in reality, there are so many different factors that have come into play that have led to that event. And this is what happens, isn't it? We often end up giving simplistic answers to what are, in reality, really complex problems. And life isn't always as black and white as we would like it. It's often not as simple as it would seem at first. And we read in verse 2, who has sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Pwy wnaeth bechu achos i'r dyn yma gael yn ddall fo ei hun neu'r rhieni? And this idea of karma is so popular in our society right now, isn't it? This idea that if you do good, good comes back to you. And if you do bad, you better watch out because you will get what's coming to you. Or this idea, maybe you've heard people say everything happens for a reason. And on the surface, these can seem like quite sound ideologies, can't they? And whatever they've been called in the past, we can see from this passage that these ideas have been around for a really long time. But as soon as something goes wrong, or we look up at the world around us, I mean, we heard already this morning, haven't we, about that awful event in Beaumaris with the car crash. We see that actually this idea of karma or that everything happens for a reason, these are not truths, and they don't actually reflect the reality of the life we live in. And karma is not what the Bible is teaching us, and nor is it teaching us that everything happens for a reason. And this isn't to say that there are no consequences to our actions. Of course there are. I mean, we see stories time and time again in the Bible, don't we, of people who do awful things, and they have to face up to the consequences of those. And we see the book of Proverbs, a whole book dedicated to general rules in life to live well. Lazy hands make poverty, but diligent hands bring wealth. And those who are kind benefit themselves, but the cruel bring ruin on themselves. But the Bible also acknowledges that life is complex, and it doesn't seek to cover up the fact that sometimes, however hard we try, things don't go well. And interestingly enough, the book that immediately follows Proverbs in the Bible is the book of Ecclesiastes, which is a whole book dedicated to wrestling with this complexity and the seeming unfairness of life. Because the truth is, however hard we try and however wise or knowledgeable we become, we will never be able to fully grasp the reasons why some things happen. And I am speaking just as much to myself here as anyone else in the room. Because at the end of the day, we are not God, and we do not have the full picture. And in trying to place the blame and decide who deserves misfortune or illness or pain, we are effectively putting ourselves in God's place. And I was trying to think of a modern day example of this, I suppose. And this story that I came across in medical school came back to me. I say it's a modern day example. It was still before I was born, but we'll go with it. So some of you here may remember back in the 70s and 80s when HIV and AIDS first became a big thing in the UK, I guess. And even now, there still is a huge stigma associated with this diagnosis, but back then, even more so. And there were so many rumors going around about how it was spread, why it was associated with certain people groups, what these people must have done in order to get the disease. And people who called themselves Christians weighed in, and they said, well, this is God's judgment on these people. They deserve to be unwell. They deserve to die for what they've done. And this sounds so hauntingly familiar to this passage, doesn't it? People wouldn't even touch these people in case they got the disease. But in the 80s, the first hospital dedicated to looking after these people was set up. And those who decided to work there were making a clear statement that these people, no matter who they are or what they had or hadn't done, were people to be valued and cared for and loved. And this is I think exactly what Jesus is saying here in the passage, and I think the Message version just puts this so well. So I'm going to read that for us now. And this is verse 1 to 5. His disciples asked, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, causing him to be born blind?" And Jesus said, "You are asking the wrong question. Dach chi'n gofyn y cwestiwn anghywir. You are looking for someone to blame. There is no such cause and effect here. Look instead for what God can do. We need to be energetically at work for the one who sent me here, working while the sun shines. When night falls, the workday is over. For as long as I am in the world, there is plenty of light. I am the world's light." Dach chi'n gofyn y cwestiwn anghywir. You are asking the wrong question. Jesus' challenge is direct and powerful, isn't it? Agorau llygad, open your eyes. Look instead for what God can do. And we need to be so careful that we don't slip into the same mindset as the disciples, that we don't become blind ourselves to what God is doing. We need to be asking the right question, not seeking to place blame. We are not God, and this is a good thing. And there comes a point where we have to accept that we cannot know all the answers. We need to look for how God can use each situation for his glory and seek what he is doing. And there is a difference between God transforming and using a painful situation for his glory and that situation happening for an allotted reason in the first place. And there is a really subtle but important distinction that needs to be made. And in this case, in this story that we read in John 9, part of God's purpose is to transform a man's pain by healing him and restoring his sight. But healing is often a messy and multi-step process, isn't it? Jesus physically gets down into the dirt, spits in the ground, and rubs it on the man's eyes, which is actually pretty strange when you think about it, isn't it? But this is not the end. Jesus then sends the man to wash the mud off again in the pool of Siloam, which means sent and vonwyd. And let's be honest, the man could have said no, couldn't he? He could have said, "You've just rubbed dirt on me. What little pride I have left is now gone. Please leave me alone." But no, he might have been so desperate he was willing to try anything. But either way, he didn't question. He went to the pool as Jesus sent him, even if the request felt strange or didn't make sense. And it's really interesting to compare this story here to the healing of a man called Naaman, who we read about in the book of 2 Kings in the Old Testament. And Naaman was the commander of the army of the king of Aram, and he held really high status in society, but he had leprosy, a skin disease. And he went to Elijah, the prophet, for healing, and Elijah told him to wash in the Jordan River 7 times, and he would be healed. And his response is a complete contrast from this one we read in John 9. It's 2 Kings chapter 5. Ond dyma Naaman yn gwylltio a mynd I ffwrdd. Naaman went away angry and said, "I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call on the name of the Lord his God, wave his hand over the spot and cure me of my leprosy. Are not the rivers of Damascus better than all the waters of Israel? Couldn't I wash in them and be cleansed?" So he turned and went off in a rage. Ac I ffwrdd ac yn mewn tymor. It's almost comical, isn't it? Wouldn't we like it if God could just wave his hand and sort out all our problems for us? I know I've probably prayed prayers like that before in the past. We'd like things to be solved on our terms, wouldn't we? We would like to be able to hold on to our pride and our self-worth. We'd prefer not to go through the mess. And we live in a society, don't we, of instant gratification, where we expect things now, but where we don't have to wait. And this is really hard. And occasionally, occasionally God does instantly transform a situation. I wouldn't dare to predict how God is going to work, but more often than not, and I can testify this in my own life for sure, Jesus takes us on a journey of faith, teaching us to trust him and obey him even when things don't make sense. So I also really feel in this passage that John is seeking to teach us about the very nature of God and his reasons for sending Jesus to the world. And we see in this story, through the healing of this man, that Jesus came to renew and restore creation to himself, to God. This is in his very nature. And God's healing hand, his love, is for everyone, no matter who they are, no matter what they may or may not have done, no matter how different they are from us, and no matter how much we may disagree with them. And as we start to zoom out from this passage and we see the wider story of the Gospels in which this one sits, we start to see the bigger picture and the story of the reconciliation of all things. And this word reconciliation, or cymodi in Gymraeg, is a big word, isn't it? But really, all it means is that restoration of that right relationship with God. God is seeking to restore things to how they were made to be in the first place. We read in verse 5 back in John 9, I am the light of the world, fi ydi golar byd. And this echoes John 8, doesn't it, that we've been reading through recently, verse 12. And we see how Jesus, being the light of the world, Jesus bringing this reconciliation, how this is achieved through the death and the resurrection on the cross. And we can have confidence in this victory, which has already been won. I also, though, really wanted to acknowledge the fact that healing can be a really hard topic, can't it? Because it's all very well reading through all these amazing stories, isn't it, in the Bible, of people being healed and all these miracles, when we ourselves may be praying for something and have been praying for something for a long time, and that prayer seems to have gone unanswered. And that can be really hard. And I do believe that God invites us to keep bringing these things to him and to keep asking, to persevere in prayer. But it is clear, isn't it, from the language used in this passage, that this man has been blind and begging for a long time. We don't know how old he was, but he has been blind since birth. Maybe he'd given up all hope. And as I was preparing, I was reminded of a situation I was in a few years ago while I was working on a medical ward, when a man from my church was admitted to the high dependency area. And he wasn't a man that I knew personally particularly well, but he was well known to some of my friends at church. And I was praying with him one morning in his side room, and I remember as we prayed together, I said, Lord Jesus, would you use this situation for your glory? And at the time, our church was going through a real period of turmoil. There was a lot of anger and bitterness and disagreement, which was causing a huge split within the church. But I watched as people from both sides of the argument came together, put down their arms to pray and care for this man who was loved on both sides. And very sadly, a few weeks later, this man passed away. And even though I was only part of his story for a very short time, I do honestly believe that our prayer was answered. As I saw people put aside their differences to serve God and care for this man, we saw a glimpse of God's kingdom and God glorified. And we have to acknowledge, don't we, that we live in this tension, in this in-between time, knowing that the victory has already been won in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But we don't always see the full fruits of this victory yet. We do still experience pain and suffering. This is a reality. And Pete Greig speaks about this in his book, God on Mute, which is an amazing book. on unanswered prayer. And he describes this in-between time as like living permanently an Easter Saturday. The price has been paid, the victory won, but we cannot see the full glory of the resurrection. And Al had this amazing picture a few weeks ago when he was speaking on John 8 of D-Day being that turning point in the war. There is no going back. The victory will surely come, but there are still battles to fight. And yet, despite living in this tension, in this difficult in-between time, our God is not a God who is distant or unacquainted with pain or suffering. And I wanted to read this passage from Isaiah 53, verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. We did not understand him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him, we saw him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted. And then, yn aeth ddiodde yn gyfarwydd a phoen. The book of Isaiah is written during a real period of turmoil and great pain for the Jewish people. Their land has been invaded, and they've been taken away to the Babylonian Empire as slaves. They can see no way out. The situation seems too big to overcome. And Isaiah is sent as a messenger from God to speak God's word over the Jews, to prophesy, to tell them of a time to come of God's plan to renew and restore. And we see glimpses of Jesus within the book, of who he is and who he will be years and years before he was born. And this is one such passage. And it describes Jesus as being acquainted with grief. He knows, not just in a cognitive sense, but has a deep personal understanding and experience of what it is to suffer. And we see this time and time again, don't we, within his life in the Gospels. We only have to look a couple of chapters ahead into John 11 and the story of Lazarus, where Jesus weeps over the loss of a dear, dear friend. And then again, as he wrestles with God in the Garden of Gethsemane. And then finally, as he is tortured and put to death on a cross, bearing the weight of all sin. The God of the universe knows our pain completely. The I am God who we heard about from Stephen a few weeks ago. Yahweh, God unchanging, who was before time even began. He came to the world to suffer and carry the weight of our sin. And we can take comfort that even when our prayers seem to go unanswered, God is right there with us, and he cares so deeply. And we can hold on to the hope and the certainty that one day all things will be made right. All things will be restored, and this day will surely come, and is already starting to come even now. We read in Psalm 27, Ond dwi'n gwybod yn iawn y bydd yn profi daio'r aglwydd a de y bew. Gobeithio yn yr aglwydd bydd yn dde ac yn hyderus. Ia, gobeithio yn yr aglwydd. We will see the goodness of God in the land of the living. Even now, as we seek to see what God is doing, as we ask the right questions, as we energetically work for the one who sent us, we will begin to see the transformation of the world around us and become transformed ourselves. And as we look back to John 9, verse 8, we see how the man is so utterly transformed that people barely recognize him. Dyma gymdogion a phawb oedd wedi weld o blaen yn cardota yn gofyn, onid hwn ydy'r dyn oedd yn arfer cardota? Roedd rhai yn dweud ia, ac eraill yn dweud nace. No, it's not him. It just looks like him. He was the same man, but they could hardly tell as he had become like a new creation after his encounter with Jesus. And I don't know if anyone else here can relate to that experience of having Jesus in their life too. So this restoration and renewal will reach its completeness when Jesus comes again, but it is also happening right now. And God invites us to step into this story and become a part of his transformation and restoration of his creation. We need to be asking the right question, Gofyn y Cwestiwn Cywir, seeking what God is doing. And at times, I truly believe that this will mean we will see miracles and we will see healings as part of this. And we should be bold in our prayers and our expectations of what God can do. But even when we do not, we can be confident that God is still working for our good and his glory. He never stops working and will never stop working until the work is done. So to finish, I would like to read from Isaiah again, chapter 42. And this is from the Message. And it says this: He won't brush aside the bruised and the hurt, and he won't disregard the small and the insignificant, but he will steadily and firmly set things right. He won't tire out and quit. He won't be stopped until he's finished his work to set things right on the earth.